Hello and welcome everyone to the third and final day of our Survivor Summit. I feel so full even just from this opening. I'm trying to get myself grounded and ready for what we're about to experience. The last 3 days have been nothing short of amazing. Over the last couple of days, we talked about how we heal and how we take action on workplace sexual harassment, restorative justice in our homes and schools and communities. We've had youth perspectives and queer and trans perspectives on surviving abuse and violence, and just much, much more. We've held really beautiful space with each other in chat comments. You know, it feels weird to have, for a lot of people to do these viral conferences and things like that, summits, because we're so used to, these are the times when we usually come and see each other and we get to be in community with each other. But I've been in awe of how we've been able to create community in virtual spaces. I've seen people loving up on each other in the chat boxes underneath the sessions and creating their own little communities. And it's just been beautiful. Like, this gathering is literally a dream come true in so many ways. For a couple of years now, we've been talking about the need to come together as survivors and offer our own vision for a world that would support us. And here we are. This is big and historic and beautiful and memorable, and just so much love pouring out from the computer screen. And we need it in this moment, I think, more than ever. And so I just want to just keep expressing my gratitude for the people who've joined us, for the folks who put this together. And I'm going to pass it to my sister, Tchen.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, Tarana. This space has been a space of hope and strength and resilience at a time when we need it the most. And this agenda is going to be a powerful tool for us to keep building that work going forward and building the power of this community. Our agenda has been sourced from survivors all over the country who are working in different communities to address different dimensions of sexual violence. Thousands upon thousands of survivors participated online and in committee to come up with this agenda. And we are so, so grateful to you, to everyone who engaged the process. You have helped to make history with this agenda. And the agenda has a few core areas that it focuses on: community safety and alternatives to the criminal legal system, changing our culture to actively promote prevention, accountability, and healing, ensuring our schools are safe and places that proactively disrupt a culture that allows for sexual violence, promoting healing justice to ensure that survivors are treated with care and compassion, affordable, safe, dignified housing and transportation for survivors, and strong workplace safety protections from sexual violence and harassment in the workplace, especially for workers in low-wage jobs. It's a broad, expansive agenda, and we also know that this agenda is a work in progress, that our dreams are vast, as they should be. And that is why we want this to be a living document. We want to acknowledge those who may have felt like their voices weren't heard in the process. We know we have a long journey ahead to listen to survivors and ensure the diversity of our voices and experiences are present. We know that survivors are a brilliant, dynamic community and not a monolith. We know that every survivor will see themselves in different parts of this agenda, and not every survivor will see themselves in every part of the agenda, and that more difficult discussion is needed on topics where we don't agree. And we're really excited to continue listening and to build on this process, and to know that this agenda is a tool, a powerful tool for us to continue doing that work. But if there's one thing that is super clear, it's that survivors are ready. We are ready. we know we should be shaping the solutions, especially those that address our experiences. Collectively, we have so much power, and we have the power to lead on solutions, and the world needs our leadership.
I couldn't agree with that more in this moment. I couldn't particularly. And this panel that we're going to have today is going to take us from here into the future. We're going to hear from two brilliant leaders and about how this agenda becomes a reality through survival organizing and action. For us, action and healing are fundamentally connected. People usually think about healing as something you take care of on your own through therapy or some private process. And action is something you do outside in the world with others to have impact. We believe that there is healing in action and action in healing. The process of coming together as survivors to shape our world is in and of itself healing. And that healing ourselves, our pain and trauma is action that is necessary for the collective good. We're excited for Tina and Yolo to join us to help us connect the dots between healing and action. Tchen is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Time's Up and Global, and longtime leader in policy and gender equity. And Yolo Akili Robinson is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. Tina and Yolo, I would love for you to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves to everyone watching. We'll start with Tina.
Oh, well, thank you, Tarana. And let me start by thanking you and Tchen and Fatima and Monica for creating this space. I remember when you first dreamed of it and talked about creating both a space for survivors, an agenda for survivors, a place to expand and amplify the voice of survivors. And congratulations, I'm getting chills just actually talking about it, and what you've been able to create here and the promise of the future. So thank you. As you said, I am the president and CEO of Time's Up. But this has been a long journey for me. I'm of the older end of the age scale, probably of attendee. But my activism on gender equity goes back to my 20s and actually is very rooted in working on survivor issues. I landed right after college in Springfield, Illinois in the 1970s, right during the Equal Rights Amendment fight. We lost that ratification fight in Illinois. But very soon after, the very next year, while I was in law school and an officer of the National Organization for Women, I teamed up with 5 other women who remain my best friends now to this day, who were running rape crisis centers and domestic violence centers in Illinois. And we rewrote the Illinois rape laws, which at the time were among the most antiquated. Had a dream to reform them, to bring them into the, into that, at that point, the 20th century, wrote the law in an example of women's leadership, found a woman sponsor, Dawn Clark Netsch, who was a state senator then. Dawn did the remarkable thing of letting us control the entire path of that legislation. We actually sat at the table during the markup of the bill. And in 1984, enacted, an incredibly progressive reform of Illinois sexual assault bills, which is an example, I think, of this topic that we're talking about today, of how you take survivor voices and make them into live action, into live change. From there, I went to law school, I became a lawyer. I did 23 years as a corporate lawyer. And then along the way, I always did politics, because you do that in Chicago. And along that way, met, a guy with a funny sounding name, big ears. Lo and behold, he goes on to become president. Who knew? And so President Obama, when he got elected in 2009, asked me to join him in the White House. And I spent all 8 years there, first working in the Office of Public Engagement, then as Mrs. Obama's chief of staff, all the time being the executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls, working with so many people who've been involved with the survivors agenda, and working on issues of violence against women and workplace fairness and working families agendas, because as a single working mom, I'd lived those issues. And so did a little bit of work on that after the White House, but then Time's Up came calling. I helped to put together the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund that is now housed at the National Women's Law Center. And then with a little bit of arm twisting, I became the full-time president and CEO of Time's Up just about a year ago. So I'm really delighted to be here. Our work is so aligned, and actually, all of you have been such an important part of the creation and the expansion and the continued growth of Time's Up.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you. It's so enriching to hear the full story behind people, or at least part of it, because I know there's more to that story. Yolo.
Yes, yes. I also, like Tina, want to just start by just expressing my immense gratitude to you all, but also to all the folks who behind the scenes have made this possible, who are watching, who are here to learn, who are here to grow, to be connected. It's just a beautiful, powerful moment. I'm grateful to be a part of it and bear witness to it. So I want to just start that with a spirit of gratitude. My name is Yolo Akili Robinson. An image description for my folks is that I am a non-binary person wearing a turquoise colored shirt and my signature dangly earrings. I am the executive director and founder of BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. BEAM is a national training, movement building, and grant making institution dedicated to the healing, wellness, and liberation of Black and marginalized communities. I've been working in community wellness about 15 years. At the variety of different intersections of a variety of different issues. Primarily has been, my initiation was in community accountability processes with folks who were both survivors and perpetuators of harm. I also have a lot of experience in work supporting the dignity and wellness of people living with HIV, as well as people living with mental conditions, which is a big part of my work and my heart. And so during that time, of course, I've had the opportunity to work with Black folks and really kind of center learning more about healing and healing justice, which I'll talk a little bit more about in our conversation as well.
Beautiful. I cannot wait for this conversation. Let's dive in. I want to start with the first question, really about this moment that we're in and the importance of survivor leadership. So why is it, Tina and Yolo, why is it important for survivors to have an agenda like this one in this moment of time amidst so much crisis and chaos? What are the opportunities for us to really intervene here as survivors? And I'm going to start with you, Yolo. What do you think about that? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, one thing, when I saw this question, or you posed this question, the first thing I think about is the reality that so many folks, but due to COVID-19 and even prior to COVID-19, we're not just survivors, we're still trying to survive, right? Trying to survive situations and scenarios, homes that are not safe, situations where we're kind of stuck in because of economic injustice and these different pieces, right? So holding that piece is critical. I think the opportunity for us, and I've seen some of it so highlighted throughout the course of this conference, is really the opportunity to imagine what safety and accountability for safety looks like beyond the criminal legal system. To think really about restorative justice and healing justice processes. How do we mobilize more of the folks in our communities to understand sexual violence, but also be able to transform the ways in which we think about what it looks like to support survivors, but also hold people accountable for the harm that happens in our communities. I think that we're seeing in this moment so much violence from the criminal legal system, which has been ongoing. And I think that any strategy that we consider must, of course, engage the criminal legal system, but also must be really hyper vigilant about really mobilizing our communities on the ground, grassroots institutions, activists, big mamas, all of us, like uncles, all of us, and the work of addressing sexual violence and supporting survivors. I think that's really, really critical. And one piece I want to make sure I'm also really mindful of holding up that's been on my heart too. I think it's really important to highlight the realities and experiences of survivors who are living with mental conditions or mental illnesses, who often have the experience of having your mental illness or mental condition used to gaslight you about your experience, right? It didn't happen. It wasn't legitimate. And I think in this moment where we're talking about in Black communities, particularly around trauma and distress, it's really important that we highlight and speak to and speak and highlight the experiences of survivors who are living with mental illness and mental conditions, and really think about how our strategies are helping to address our needs and our wellness as well.
I couldn't agree more. I'm so glad you lifted up that piece about mental illness. It's such a huge issue. And I think not just for survivors, but for our culture and society as a whole in this time. And there's so much that survivors can teach us, right, about how we need to be supporting people with mental illness and how we can heal collectively from this time. So thank you for lifting that up. Tina, what are your thoughts on this question of why it's so important for us to have an agenda, and what are the opportunities?
No, absolutely. Well, let me first acknowledge that times are hard. right? I mean, this is a heavy, hard moment. And if you entered into this moment already with a great deal of heaviness, and trauma in your life, now with what's happening in the external world, and it feels like during this year is, body blow after body blow collectively, it makes it hard. And so I want to acknowledge that I think all of us are feeling that heaviness and how hard it is, and the distance. As Tarana mentioned, we're used to getting energy from one another in a room together, and closeness and the hugs and strength, and we're trying to get that virtually. So this is hard to do, and yet it's so important, because in a moment of crisis is when change happens, and sometimes exponential change. And I think we're in that period right now, and we're going to be in that period in the months to come, where lots of things can happen at lots of different levels of federal, state, wherever, local, just in your city. Change can happen, and having the lived experience of survivors and their voices and their needs and their perspectives in how those changes are shaped is critically important. It's critically important. I've been doing a lot of reading about, our Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the last week with the loss. And when you read her opinions and her dissents, she spoke from a place of being a woman who worked, and her lived experience. And so she shaped major changes in our laws because she brought that to the work she did. And it's a lesson for all of us of how to bring that lived experience that we've had, and turn pain into action and really give voice to that. Which is why what you're doing here with the survivor agenda, I'm really laying out across so many different dimensions, the different ways in which survivor needs, need to be paid attention to and shaped, and should influence the choices that are being made about things like housing changes and transportation changes, criminal justice changes. One of the things we did, and when I told the story of what we did when we changed the law back in the 80s, was to bring survivor experiences who had been just completely ignored because of the way the state of the law was, and brought them to the table in front of the legislature. I want to really convey how powerful your personal stories are as survivors, because when you tell that story and you confront people who are policymakers with them, they can't deny it. They can't deny what's happening, and they've got to then figure out, okay, how do I take what I just learned and said, and bring that into the public policy changes that we're making. So that's the opportunity, but I acknowledge how hard it is.
Yeah, it is hard, and it seems like we're also just in this moment of opportunity where we can bridge into and from the experience of just speaking truth to power, and also with this agenda actually really defining the solutions, right, from the perspective of survivors, our vision, our ideas, our strategies, right, bring those to the table in a whole new way alongside our stories.
No, absolutely. What I think is brilliant about the agenda is, as we talk about in Time's Up a lot, we want to deal with the trauma and the aftermath and the healing, but we also need to understand that we want to build a world where we're preventing this from happening. And that requires us to act in a lot of different dimensions, because it's power structures, right? It's our culture. It is the structures in our workplaces that allow harassment and abuse, to perpetuate, that, prevent women and people of color and LGBTQ and disabled workers from rising to positions of leadership and power where they can change things. And so all of that, Kim Crenshaw's brilliant phrase of intersectionality has so many meanings, right? And we need to sort of apply that learning to all of these dimensions and act in all of them if we really want to sort of really change and imagine a new future. And that's what I think, all of us need to be doing. Is what we're doing at Time's Up. What I love about what you're doing with the Survivors Agenda is to see all of those different ways in which we need to be acting.
So, I thank you, Tina. I think about the opportunities, about that question and what our opportunities are. And I think one of the biggest opportunities that gender was putting out the the idea into the world that survivors are leaders, that we are capable of leadership. And I guess I'm curious to know from both of you why you think it's important for survivors to be seen as leaders and policy shapers, and for survivors to be speaking to something beyond their trauma, right? Because we are often called to testify at hearings and tell our stories at rallies, but we're not often on to for the solutions to those issues that we're trying. A little bit about why you think it's important for survivors to be seen as leaders and policy shapers, and to speak to something beyond our trauma. We can start with Yolo.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I want to just add one brief tag on to the conversation around healing. I love the pieces that you lifted up, Tina, around like the need for healing. And I want to honor and acknowledge that in order for us to do that work, to cultivate healing in our communities, we have to address the systemic and structural barriers to healing for so many of our folks, whether it is the inaccessibility, it is the ways in which often the systems that are supposed to be for healing in this country, the mental health industrial complex, actually creates so much harm and violence against not only survivors, but all folks who are trying to access care. And so I want to name that as a critical intervention of talking about holistic health, and not just uplifting models of care that have been validated by the system as the only legitimate forms of care. To answer your question, the question, Tarana, I'm gonna speak from my own experience. One of the reasons I feel like it's very important for me to be very visible as a survivor, talking about policy and shaping leadership, is that as a non-binary person who's projected as a man who has lived and works very deeply in queer cis male communities, I recognize that oftentimes people don't think of survivors and look at me and think of me as a survivor. And often that many gay men and many non-binary folks who are survivors often feel like they are not a part of that conversation, or don't even see the violence and harm that has happened to them as sexual assault, because of the ways in which in many gay male communities, I would argue, such a high degree of harm is normalized in the culture, right? And so I think it's really important for me to be visible and to speak and to share my story and my experience, because I know that every time that I do, it gives people an opportunity to see how I've been able to not allow myself to be defined by what happened to me, but by what I chose to do with what happened with me, if that makes sense. And like in terms of transforming it into an opportunity for me to go deeper into my healing, an opportunity for me to help support other survivors, other folks who are on their healing journey. And so I think that's really, really critical, because I think just as Tina and you also lift up, Tarana, so often the narrative and the perception of what a survivor is, who a survivor is, and what a survivor is capable of doing is often, most people's imagination is a, quote unquote skinny white woman who's like a cisgender white woman, heterosexual woman. And the reality is that survivors come from, we are very diverse in who we are, right? And so I think it's really important for me to lift that up. And that's why I do the work that I do and try to be so hyper vigilant about really engaging these conversations in communities that historically have not been seen as survivors, or the people who even can experience harm and sexual violence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That resonates with me so much in so many different ways. Like, that is precisely why I do the work in the same way, for the same reasons, that there are diversity of us, and even within our particular race or gender or whatever, there's more diversity in that, and our breadth of experiences are so vast, and we have to find ways to stand up so that people can identify themselves in our leadership. Absolutely. Tina, I'm curious to hear your yeah,
I got a lot of things. But I want to pick up on this last thing that you said, Tarana, because I think, man, this is what we do to ourselves in the progressive movement, in women's movements, all the time, right? We go to our corners on our one particular perspective, and we kind of stay there, right? And we're kind of, working in parallel with somebody, but we're not really listening, and we're not coming together, and we don't honor different viewpoints. and we don't, empower people, to speak their truth and hold leadership. And you're right, what you said about, so oftentimes survivors get asked to be part of the rally to talk about their story, because people just want, there's this riveting on that part of the story without being able to show leadership on now the solution that gets turned to somebody else. And that's something that is great about this survivors agenda coming together. But I really feel in this next period that we're about to enter into, we progressives across the board, I feel so strongly, need to model a different way of making change. Not to get a little, dealing with the outside politics, but I think we've got to recognize that the federal court system is about to stop being a lever for change for us, right? We have, since Thurgood Marshall, charted a path for us on civil rights. That was kind of our bulwark, was we were hoping the federal courts would help us, and Title IX and those other things. I think we got to confront the fact that after today, it's likely to not be a course of action for us. But that just should energize us to do things, to be active in other spaces, like state legislatures, like cities and towns. I mean, let's be real, police budgets and the way police operate is not dictated by the federal government. It's dictated by mayors and city councils, and what the criminal justice system looks like in your city is determined by those local officials. And we need to be acting in those spaces, but we need to be acting together. So I really want to be a voice and a call for all of us who are progressives to sort of believe in an agenda of equity and justice and fairness, working in collaboration with one another, listen to one another. As Ijen said, listen to the diversity of views, even within the survivor community that exists, create space and grace for everyone to be heard. And because out of it will come our strength, will come our strength for what I believe is a very long fight to come that we're in right now. We are like at the beginning of it. And even though these last sort of 38 days feel like the end of it, we are really at the beginning of it to make the sustainable change that we want to see. But it really, really depends upon us, I think, all working together in concert with one another. We won't always agree with each other's agenda, but if we support one another's agenda, then we're all going to get parts of our agenda enacted, by working together, listening to each other, listening to the differences, and being in partnership and true coalition with one another. And that's what, time's up, that I'm so clear that that's what we need to do. And I tell our folks all the time, we need to be good partners and good listeners, lead when it's our turn to lead, but be good followers when it's our turn to follow. And, survivor voices, being leaders, not just in telling that trauma story, but in also telling the healing part and getting to the issues that need to change. Right? That is so important. And so important for the rest of us to create that space and create that support and be good partners when that happens. And I really feel so strongly that is the thing that we now need to head into and do in this next, let's be honest, in this next fight that we've got ahead of us, right now.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. And I had this image of a jazz band come to mind when you were speaking, where, right, we're all we've got the same kind of baseline melody and rhythm, but we're bringing different instruments to the table, and we step forward at different moments for our solos, and we support each other, and it's one coherent thing. And that's, I think, when movements come together and we're at our best and our most powerful, that's what it is. We each bring our unique offering. And sometimes that comes to the forefront, and sometimes it's in the background, but it's all part of the kind of the movement, the energy, the music that we need to make. And I think it's tough, for this question of survivor leadership, the word leadership can be kind of intimidating, I think, right? Like a lot of us don't think of ourselves as leaders, and I think that's totally fair, especially when we have models of leadership that are creating harm in real time in our lives, right? And so just thinking about what survivor leadership means and looks like, I'd love to hear from the two of you. You've been in all kinds of circles and spaces with survivors. Starting with Yolo, kind of what are some of the different ways that you've seen survivors step into their power and leadership and voice? And if you have suggestions for people who are really grappling with, like, am I a leader? What is, am I power? Like, how do I express that? Like, what would you say?
Yeah, I love that you brought up that term, the term of leadership, and the ways in which people immediately imagine often the CEOs are the people who are like, like people who are at the forefront on the television shows and all those different pieces. But the reality is we all are leaders in different ways in our communities, right? A big part of Beam's work is we believe that we have to, cultivate village care. And so we recognize that the leaders in communities are, sometimes in Black communities, the barbers and the stylists and the big mamas and the Uncle Joes and all those, those folks are leaders. Those folks are opinion leaders and thought leaders. And that when we connect with them and build relationships and when they are both advocates for survivors or in their survivor leadership, that's how we can really lead to transforming communities, right? I have some suggestions for, when I think about like some things for us to be mindful of as leaders who are survivors of survivor leadership. And I think that one piece that I see so much in our work is that oftentimes, because of the way internalized capitalism works, we believe that if I just go out and do as much work for other people, that is going to be my healing, right? And I think that that's, and what ends up happening is we realize somewhere on our journey that that's not the case, that we actually have to begin to engage a process with community, with individuals around our own specific healing and not just externalize it to create an organization, to create a movement, et cetera, right? In Beam, we talk about a concept called Martyr Nurturing. And Martyr Nurturing is a caring style that centers the desecration and denial of self as a mechanism to support and sometimes control others, right? And Martyr Nurturing is something I think that I know that I learned. I think it's something that's very deeply ingrained in our culture, that if I just give to other survivors, if I give to other folks so much, that somehow I'm going to get a healing while I'm still actively avoiding the ways in which my own trauma and unique trauma is showing up, the ways in which my own unique distress is showing up in my life. And also being mindful that, as survivors and as leaders, that our trauma and distress will impact or inhibit our own leadership styles. It will show up in how we're able to support other folks. It will show up in our limitations and in all those different pieces. And so I think that a big critical piece I would hold for us in the work and for my folks and continue to hold is that we have to be really hyper vigilant about understanding that our own internal healing, our own kind of feedback, receiving feedback on our leadership, our own kind of healing process is just as critical as getting in the streets. It's just as critical as building an institution and an organization. And that what happens so often is that our organizations and systems are not sustainable or they fall apart because our leadership models have not been integrating that care, have not been integrating that let me check in on what's going on within me, not just what's going on within the organization. Let me see what's in where my heart, my spirit, my mind is. And honoring that, I think about and honoring that means that our leadership will look different. I think about disability justice and the work of like Leah Lakshmi, really lifting up like what happens to our movements when we actually center disabled, queer, and trans folks, right, and women, right? How do we have to move differently when we're talking about folks who are living with chronic illnesses and conditions? How does it make us stop to think that like, maybe we need to pause, maybe we need to revisit the timelines we have on certain pieces. Certain pieces we have to be really insistent upon, but there's also some ways in which we have an urgency addiction for things that are not necessarily about urgency, but are about our push to our anxiety that push us to keep pushing, moving as an avoidance mechanism for dealing with our own stuff, right? And so I really want to hold that for all of our folks who are doing so much amazing work, that I want to invite you to do the work with yourself as well, to understand that that's just as important, and to really grapple with, as we all do, the deeply embedded misogyny, sexism, and patriarchy that tells us otherwise, that tells us our feelings don't matter, that our bodies are not valuable, which I know that Black women and Black femme folks particularly consistently here in this country. And so I really want to lift those pieces up and say, we can model a different type of leadership. We call it a Beam healing-centered nurturing, right? So what does it mean when I nurture and I support and I community support the world from a place of healing-centeredness? How do I show up in that where the priority is my internal wellness, and that I can radiate from that center? But that's just not the model that something I learned, and from brilliant folks who trained me, and we're all unlearning together. And I think that's one piece I really want to lift up for our movements to be sustainable and do the critical work that Tina just laid out for us that is ahead of us. We have to integrate these things. Last piece I will say, not as self-care, but as community care is important too. Like, and I say that because self-care is not an adequate response to structural violence. It is really community care that sustains us. Very few things are sustainable when it's just me doing it, right? I have to I gotta have Tarana call me. I gotta have my friends call me and be like, hey, what you doing? You're doing a lot. Sit down somewhere. What you taking your medication? Are you doing those pieces? We need collaboration. And I want to encourage us to really highlight community and help cultivate community for so many of our folks who are in isolation, our folks as a way to move away from this individualistic kind of perspective, which is feels like another weight. People are like, now I gotta do self-care too by myself. That's a lot, right? So I want to lift those pieces up.
Ooh, so much wisdom.
Really. First of all, you both convicted us on this thing. Everybody's like, ooh, that's something for me to think about. But also so much just with Tina, did you go? I got caught up in the
Oh no, I didn't. But here, so on a different tack, but wow, I'm still really Yolo giving that was like but I want to tell a little story about leadership, survivor leadership, just to so from my time at the White House. So as many of you know and remember, one of the things we did in the Obama administration was to issue the Dear Colleague letter to schools, that really said all schools receiving federal funding needed to have a plan to deal, address sexual assault on campus, and in schools, which is rampant. Vice President Biden, sort of issued that. We put it out in 2011. And actually, I will be honest with you, we figured schools would listen. We just put it out. We're the federal government. We issue this letter. We put the letter out. 2 years later, sort of in 2013, after the re-elect in 2012, it was a group of students. I remember this meeting. I had hundreds of meetings in the 8 years. This one is so vivid in my memory. We had a group of students who came to meet with us, me and Lynn Rosenthal, who was the VP's, White House advisor against sexual violence against women. And it was these students, it was about 10 of them, I think, from all different schools, men and women, all of whom were survivors, all of whom came to lay out for us the actual responses of their schools. And we're talking about Ivy League schools and state schools, the whole range. Some of the schools that actually some of us had gone to, they were our schools, and we were horrified at the ways, even after we had issued this letter, they were treated. They were told, oh, there's nothing we can do about your assaulter. You should withdraw from school for this semester. And oh, by the way, we are not going to refund your tuition for this, all of those things. It was that meeting and those voices of those young people, right? They were just graduated from college. Some of them were still in school, who spoke out, who led us from the White House to create the President's Task Force on, to protect students from violence, sexual assault on campus. That was really born out of the voices of survivors who showed, leadership in telling their story and what needed to be done to be held people accountable, and had ideas. They were smart. They came to us with things like they had done their research and they said, you should be using Title IX this way, and you should be, addressing these issues this way. That formed the basis for what many of you know we did over the course of the next 3 years, which was extensive recommendations, all of which the current administration is undoing, which is an entirely different story. But it was those young people's voices and doing it in community. To your point, Yolo, I will also say that the other way to act is with others. Don't feel you have to do this by yourself. And it was that group, and they were so diverse. They had diverse experiences. It was those diverse experiences that informed the broad work that we did. So really, it was their voices directly to an executive order signed by President Obama, the President of the United States at the time. And that's the impact, that having survivor voices come to the table to not just tell what happened to them, but tell what would be the solutions, right? What would be the answers? That's the kind of impact that can happen. And I've seen it, right? I've enacted it personally.
That's such a dead on and perfect way, response to this, and example for exactly what we're talking about in action, so people can understand that this is a reality. I think other thing is people, just like in like civil rights movement, we turn people into icons and we don't remember or realize that they're everyday people who either got fed up, who made up their mind and were determined to do something. And they continued and were consistent and were able to make change. So everybody, nobody's, there's no special gift that you have to have except for the determination and tenacity. So I appreciate that. I appreciate both of your answers. And we are coming close to the end of our time together. But I want to ask you both for closing thoughts. And I want you to also, in your closing thoughts, tell me, what is your rallying cry in this moment? This is a moment for those of us who are out at the forefront of this work, both around survivor justice, but in general around social justice. We are very busy in this moment. And as much as there's a lot of sort of gloom and doom and sadness and nervousness, there is so much hope and there's so much good that has happened in this year. If we, can peek through some of the mucky muck, there have been some opportunities that have come about, and there's been some changes that we never thought we'd see. So I'm interested to hear from you, your closing thoughts, and what would you tell the people listening to rally them for what's next?
Tina, I'll let you go first. I know I'm first.
All right, so I do have one. I do have a rallying cry and I have a focus, because as hard as things are right now, and as many blows we've taken to, from what goes on in Kentucky, right, to the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the silver lining in this particular moment is that we are at the moment that happens, every November, where we actually have the power. I mean, this next 38 days, my rallying cry is vote, and tell everybody you know to vote, because this is the most powerful thing that we can do. No matter what our agenda is, like everything we care about and everything that the survivor agenda that you all have laid out is on the ballot this year in a way that has never been clearer, right? The choices have never been clearer. So I think that voting is the most important thing to do. And my message is go out and do it. Call everybody you know. Don't assume that your family members are registered and they know how to vote. It's a complicated year on figuring out how to vote, right? If you're older, what to do with the deadlines for getting a ballot. Maybe, what's the deadlines for going to the early voting. Early voting places may change because people are short on election judges. Don't assume that the voting place that you've gone to for years and years and years is going to be the voting place for early voting or on November 3rd. So do the research to find out. OneWeAllVote.org, is the organization I work with Mrs. Obama, where if you go to WhenWeAllVote.org, you can find all the things, put in your address, you'll get all the information you need about your state and your city and the requirements. But really, I've emailed my entire family. they are annoyed that yes, Auntie Tina, we were going to go vote, but don't take anything for granted. Don't let any hurdles that are being put in our way with voter suppression get in our way. None of the hurdles are like the hurdles that John Lewis went through, right? Or, think of the people before us who fought to get us to this moment. This is the moment where the power is ours. Really is ours. And it doesn't even matter if you're not in a target state. I think blue states need to run up big vote totals too. We need to demonstrate that we, as people of color, as women, as people who care about justice and equity, are the majority of this country. And we have a moment where we can do it in the next 38 days. So my rallying cry for the next 38 days is vote. And tell everybody you need to vote.
So good.
Thank you. Yolo.
Yeah, I have three brief rallying cries. The first one is that survivor leadership will not be sustainable without ongoing self-healing and community care. I want to make sure that's very clear to our folks. The long battle ahead of us that we have will not be sustainable. We will not be able to engage if we do not do self-healing and community care strategies for our folks. The second piece I definitely want to lift up to vote. If you can vote, please do vote. And I also want to lift up the necessity and critical nature of reimagining and building different systems outside of the current dominant system, whether that is healing and mental health, whether that is responses to harm, restorative justice, and transformative justice practices. I think of us having a multi-pronged strategy. of getting out to vote, to engage the broader system, and also reimagining and building new systems without the validation of those other spaces, right? We have the opportunity to reimagine the world, and we have to take critical intervention to support our folks during this time to make that possible for survivors and all of us.
So powerful. Whew. All right. I'm inspired. I'm agitated. I'm energized. I'm all the things right now. And we've got some questions from our audience and our community of survivors. The first question we have is from Vanessa, who wants to know, how do we prioritize healing and mental health in public policy formulations? Right? Because it's not like healing happens in the community and policy happens over here, right? How do we bring these two together? Yolo, do you have thoughts on that?
I do, and I'm going to keep it short because I have. I think there are, BEAM has been working with a lot of policy partners, and there's some pieces that are part of the kind of dominant conversation we're having right now around healing. And one of them I'll lift up is that, particularly for healing, we have to vigorously continue to defund the police and redirect that income and money that goes to crisis support services, to wellness support services, to institutions and individuals that can show up and support our communities without violence and murder, right? So quite frankly, that has to absolutely happen. And it needs to happen not, as I've tweeted about, we don't need counselor cops. We don't need counselor cops who are committed to pathologizing our people and actually just forcing them into other kinds of systems of incarceration, because too often the mental health industrial complex is deeply wedded to the prison industrial complex in this country. So we need to really think about how do we build policy that supports efforts of innovative peer support care, community-based care, led by people living with mental illness or conditions, people who are formerly incarcerated, not just folks who have degrees from institutions, but have no lived experience. That is critical for our policy, I think, policy initiatives across the country.
That's right. And we got one more question from Deidre, who wants to know, and especially in the context of this week, right? How do we create policies that hold police and prosecutors accountable to treating survivors of color and other marginalized survivors equitably? Tina, do you have thoughts on that question?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is so much that needs to be done, obviously, because our existing policies clearly aren't working. The existing court processes aren't working. Which is why it gets me back to my last piece, that those are local policies many times, right? What happens with police is a state matter, it's a city matter. And those are, we can, if we do what we can electorally and in electing folks and developing that agenda that supports them and holding the people that we are electing accountable or electing ourselves. I mean, here's the thing, this isn't just like politicians need to be somebody else. They can be us, right? We can run, survivors can run and hold office and bring that and actually change the policies, because that's what we need to do to hold people accountable. Is we've got to put people in positions of power who are us to actually do that, which is why, I probably come at this, I will be perfectly transparent from a more traditional point of view on, how do we work the politics? Because that's just how I grew up in doing that through electoral politics. But I do believe that we can do that. And we are seeing that, in places, where you've got young people who are running for office and winning and starting to move. You see the younger women who got elected this last round in Congress. You see, we have more women running, 583 women running for Congress right now, more than any ever before. So we can run. We've got, Lucy McBath, who lost her son to gun violence, ran for Congress and won, and is making a difference from her perspective as the mother, of a child who was lost. That lived experience we talked about at the beginning, you can bring that to the fore as a city council person, right? As the person who's actually making school policy around what our education should be and support for kids in sexual assault and the teaching of how to actually break the culture, if you run for your local school board. I think that's the thing that we need to do, is to also be working on the outside, but also working to transform those inside power structures so that they address the needs that we have. So I'm back to my last point, which is right now we got to vote. The next 38 days are kind of critical, but doesn't just end. People have a tendency to like now the presidential election's over, I get to go home again. It's like, no, No. First, you got to like hold the people who just got elected accountable. And then you got to start recruiting folks. Let's see, who we can get to run who are us in the next cycle and the next cycle after that. To be clear, this is what they do, right? Mm-hmm. This is what the people who do not agree with us do. And that's why they're in the positions that they are in right now, to do the things that they are doing. And so we need to fight that.
That's right. All right. So as we move towards close, one last question from Reed, who is watching, which is, what comes next? How do we sustain this momentum and stay connected in the fight? What do you think, Yolo?
Ooh. I don't know, y'all give me these big questions.
Because you're so wise.
Yeah, it's a wide question. It's a big question. I will say this. When I think about answering that question, I think about first like checking in with your body and your spirit and your heart and yourself first, to figure out what you're able to engage and how you're able to engage to make what comes next for you, right? Because not all of us are in the same capacity. Not all of us are in the same places. So it's important for us to start that piece. If we want to talk about undoing Martyr Nurturing, we want to start with checking in. Where am I at? What do I have the capacity to show up in, to understand what even is next for me? And then also looking at the community around us and the conditions and what our community can sustain and support us with as well is a question I would lead us to ask at first. I could give you what my particular pieces is. I think you've gotten that sense around like what I think it is, but I really want to encourage folks to begin that process from where am I at? Where's my capacity? What are also my needs? What are my community's needs? And how do I move and act from that place, right? And it will get us to some similar places, but it also will be very different based on our abilities, based on our locations, etc. So that's how I would answer that question.
Beautiful. Thank you. Tina, do you have anything to add on sustaining momentum?
I do. I have one particular thought, and that is, you've now created this community. So from this moment, from this summit, is a powerful launching point. If you keep the community, I mean, that's the thing. What has sustained me for doing this work for 40 years is the community that I have around me, because none of us do this alone. We're more powerful as a community and as an organization. So my biggest thing I'm moving forward from here is to take these connections that got made over the last 3 days, right, and sustain them and keep them and turn to one another, create ways, whether it's listservs and more Zoom calls and other contacts, send your information, publicize the event that your organization is doing to others, and publicize somebody else's events to your membership. Do all of those things that will build and sustain this community that is now created, because that is the power, right? It is not just because you can show up in numbers, it's because you can sustain each other. All the things Yolo is talking about sustaining and how, when I reflect back on my life, I got it from the community that I got in doing this work. My best friends in life are the people that I, did this work with. I'm going to brunch tomorrow with the women who I wrote that law with in 1984. Seriously. And that is what sustains you in the work, but it makes you more powerful. So, I mean, that's to end where we began, Tchen and Tarana, what you all have created here with this summit is that foundation to launch into the next piece, because it is creating that community and those connections across the board. And that's my biggest message, is sustain that, right? Even in a pandemic, even when we're all like sitting at home in our little corners of our rooms, figure out a way to sustain that. And that's the power that we need to move forward.
That's a word to end on. I thank you. Thank you to Yolo and Tina so much for your wisdom and your leadership. This was really a perfect pairing for the closing, for this, particular moment in the summit. And we're excited to work with both of you on moving this agenda forward. This agenda becomes real if and when we make it real. To your point, Tina, right? We're heading into a really important election. We all know this. And with so much going on, it's easy to think nothing's really going to change, right? We can settle into that idea that nothing's going to change, nothing ever changed. And it's hard to think about how to prioritize something like voting when you're trying to, keep your job and feed your family and not get COVID. But every day that we don't engage, we don't vote or advocate for our agenda, someone else's agenda is dominating. That's what happens. There's always an agenda. If we're not pushing ours, somebody is pushing theirs, and it will take over the space that we should be occupying. Survivors are powerful. We've already driven so much change in our culture on these issues. To your point, Tina, again, and now it's time to drive change in our policies and politics. This is the way we as survivors can start to shape not just the conversation, but the services, programs, and policies that support us. This is the most important way that everyday people in our country have their voices heard. And it's the starting point for us as survivors to realize the promise of this agenda.
Yep, and that's why we're asking you to join us. We are asking you to join us by texting Survivors Agenda to 97779. Again, one more time, that's Survivors Agenda, all one word, so no space between the two words, to 97779, because we need you. This community you are a part of this community, and you're going to be a critical part of our ability to realize the promise of this agenda. And yes, we're in it together. Mm-hmm. You are not alone. We are in this together. And I do want to say that this whole agenda and summit was a labor of love on the part of so many people. And I just want to take a moment before we close to thank the incredible partners and the incredible core team behind this work. You all are amazing and inspiring and have made history with this. And I want to especially shout out some people who were really the heart and soul of our ability to come together, and so that we can all give them some love. Alicia J., Arvia Walker, Denise Beek, Celeste Faison, Danny Ayers, Nikita Mitchell, Emily Martin, Farron Harvey, Kelly Bruner, Tegan Ahern Dixon. Thank you so much for your work. And thank you to our incredible Survivors Agenda team, our production team at Happily, to our funders for making this event possible, including the Collective Future Fund, the Ms. Foundation for Women, and the Levi Strauss Foundation. Thank you. And so from here, the work continues, my friends. Please join us again, texting Survivors Agenda, all one word, to 97779. And don't forget to make a plan to vote. Make all of us, especially Tina, happy, and make a plan to vote. Our healing and our ability to move forward toward this beautiful vision and agenda depends on it. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it back to my sister Tarana to officially close us out. Love y'all.
Oh man, I have so much love. Like, my heart is beating fast at how, I've said this for the last few days, I've had few professional experiences that have felt like this. Doesn't even really feel like a professional experience, because it just is so much love and understanding and cooperation. And it's just been beautiful to have this. I want to take a minute to shout out our steering committee as well. We had organizations come together from across the different spaces of work against sexual violence to make this thing come to life. And so definitely want to shout them out. They're all listed on the Survivors Agenda website. And I just want to say thank you to the people who have been tuning in, even if you only tuned in today. You know, we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of Me Too going viral in a few weeks, right? October 15th. And of course, I'm always thinking about then and now. And one of the things that was really hard for me when Me Too went viral was watching survivors, people who I don't know, but who I know, watching them bleed all over the internet, pour their stories out, you know, all over the internet with very few containers to process. And then I watch people who are in the field who do this work rush to do what we do best, right? To create those spaces. And so the organizations who have been on the front lines for years got together quickly to try to figure out how to support. And organizations like Time's Up and Survivors Know came up and they started, we got to work, right? Immediately, we have to do something about it because that's what we do, we get to work. And even with all of that quick response and the survivors who were really pouring their hearts out by saying me too, the dominant narrative about what this moment meant has still persisted, that it was something nefarious, that it was a witch hunt, that it was something about taking down people who cause harm. And the conversation for the last 3 years has, despite our best efforts, largely been around the people who caused harm, all while building this movement on the backs of the people who experienced harm. It is the survivors, the people who labored to say me too, the people who sat there staring at their screen trying to decide whether they should put this hashtag out, the people who took a moment to write long blog posts about what happened to them 20, 30 years ago, the people who have been holding this thing in the back of their throat and never thought they could vocalize it and finally got an opportunity to. That is how we got here. It's not about any media mogul or news person. It's not about any person who has put effort into causing harm. It is about us. And this summit and this agenda and this moment is about us, those of us who call ourselves in leadership, creating an offering and a space to say, we will not build a movement on the backs of survivors. This is a movement built by and for survivors. We're not just here to tell our story. We're here to tell you that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And so I'm feeling emotional. But I think it's important that we carry that as we move out of this agenda. This is our movement if we say it's ours. And so this moment and this agenda and this summit is about saying this is ours. Nobody gets to define it. Nobody gets to define who we are and how we move. We move collectively, and we move well when we move collectively. We make mistakes, we make missteps, and it's okay because we do it in love, and we will continue to try, and we will continue to sometimes make mistakes, and we will get up and we will continue to move in love and move together, because surviving is power. We've already survived the hardest thing we could ever survive, right? We've already done that. We've already proven that we can survive. And so now we will thrive, and we will thrive together. I'm sorry for my shaky voice, but I just want to leave us with that. We are thriving now. We have been surviving for a long time, and now we are modeling what it looks like to thrive together. So thank you so much for trusting us. Thank you for standing with us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for just being in community, and just stick with us. We're going to stick with you. We're going to stick together. And what's next is more of this. So I'm gonna end, and also I will end on saying vote too. We're gonna do some harm reduction in the polls. I know it's difficult for a lot of survivors this year, and we have a lot of questions, but we are going to try to do the best we can with what we have to reduce the harm, right? If I have to pick my opponent, if I have the luxury of picking my opponent, I want to do that. And so voting doesn't mean we've won, right? It means that we can pick the challenge, how the challenge looks moving forward. So anyone, stay tuned. There's more Survivor Summit today. There's a youth track. If you have young people, get them tuned in and registered to be on the youth track. And thank you.